So what I want to cover in this video is the anti-spam settings in Microsoft 365 and Office 365. Now you'll find those in the administration center for your tenant. So basically we need to power up a browser. We need then to go to our Office 365 tenant. We need to be logged in as an administrator. Select the admin to go to the admin console. And this is where we'll do a lot of the configuration. Now, there are a couple of different places that we can do this configuration. The older location is in the Exchange Management console. So select that. Let's pop over there first and just get a look at the older settings. Now, all of these anti-spam settings you'll find in the protection option here. And you'll see that we have an option here for the spam filter and the outbound spam filter, which we will talk about. So we'll start with the spam filter, but before we get into that, I just want to run over a conceptual layout of how anti-spam works in Microsoft 365. Okay, so here we are on the conceptual layout of the inbound filtering for anti-spam. So you'll see that the way it works is that when an email message comes in, it's going to go through the normal perimeter protections provided by Microsoft. That's going to look at the IP address. It's going to look at blacklists. It's also going to send it through a number of different antivirus engines for scanning. And if it's bad, it will obviously throw that away. The next thing to remember here is that your transport rules kick in directly after this. So you can use transport rules to bypass a lot of the other policies that you put in place. So again, remember that the policy for transport rules comes before your anti-spam protection. Now, once we've gone through all that, our next option is our anti-spam protection. So you'll see that we have the ability to nominate safe senders. We have content scanning. We have SPF and sender ID filtering, bulk mail, international spam, and advanced spam management. So this is what we're going to spend most of our time with in this video, having a look at that for inbound and also outbound filtering. Now, if you do have advanced threat protection, which is part of Microsoft 365 Business and E5, then basically what you're going to be able to do is add an additional layer of protection basically on top of that. Now, remember that ATP technically is an anti-spam, right? So that's doing your malware protection through safe attachments and safe links, as well as doing anti-spoofing. So the majority of your anti-spam is going to be done via Exchange Online. This means it's going to be available in all plans. So this is going to be relevant for Office 365 as well as Microsoft 365 as well. So with that conceptual diagram in our heads, let's go back and actually have a look at these policies in the real world. Okay, so we're back here in our Exchange Admin Center on the spam filter option here in protection. And you'll see this is the inbound spam filtering, which we've just talked about briefly. Now, one of the best practices I recommend is to have another policy rather than modifying the default. So you do get a single default policy when you spin up a tenant, but my advice to you would be, as best practice, is to create at least one other additional anti-spam policy. This gives you the flexibility to turn it off, to adjust it, to delete it, if you need to. So again, leave the default one as is, and the way it works, it will work through generally your policies, and then the very last policy it will work through is the default policy. So again, I would not recommend that you modify the default policy, go in and create your own, as I've done here. Now, to see what the policy settings are, we simply select that policy and hit the edit button over here, and you'll see that we can give it a name. We can also determine the actions we want to take on spam. Now, you do have the options here to, again, do things like quarantine, delete the message, and so on. My best practice recommendation would be to move it to junk folder. I know a lot of people like to move it to quarantine. I think that adds an additional complication and makes it more difficult for users to determine what is spam and malware and phishing and all that. So my personal best practice is to move it to the junk mail folder. You can certainly vary that as you need. Now, under that, you'll see that we have the option here to basically mark our bulk email as spam. Now, this is based on a threshold, and you'll see that the thresholds range from 1 through to 9. 7 is the default. My, again, best practice would be generally to set that at 6. Now, you can go in and adjust this after the fact to see what gives you better performance, better results. But again, remember that my best practice I would recommend is probably around a 6. Now, if you do set up to have your messages quarantined, how long do you want to retain those messages in quarantine is what you can set here. Again, plus some options for quarantine around the redirection and so on. Now, we can also go in here and look at block lists. So block lists are going to, again, block email from particular senders that you want to nominate in here, and also particular domains. So if you do not wish to receive email from a particular sender, put in the top here, and again, if it's a particular domain, you put it in the lower box here. Now remember, this will apply to all users that are part of this policy. So this is, again, blocking across the user environment. We have our allow lists. All right, so again, these are things that you want to always get through no matter what, and not to be marked as spam. Again, you can adjust those as needed. And here's our international spam. So again, best practice is if you don't expect to receive emails in a foreign language, for example, I can't say that I will be expecting emails to come in Arabic. I can select to filter that message and I can add the country in there. All right, so again, I can also choose to filter the email messages from the following countries or regions. So the top one here is the languages. The one underneath is the actual source location. Again, I can select that and I could exclude countries around the world. Certainly recommend that if you don't expect to receive messages in a foreign language. In our advanced settings, again, this is probably the most important thing to go and configure in your environment. This is basically going to increase the spam score on emails that marked by the options that you have here. So if you consider that images linked to remote sites to be more likely to be spam, you would set that to on. Numeric IP addresses, they're considered more likely to be spam. Yes, you set that to on. Now, the most important one I would recommend that you turn on here is this SPF record hard fail. So what that means is that if the message fails the SPF, then basically it will be treated far more likely to be spam, and that again would be the major recommendation I would have here. But certainly go through all of these options and set them as appropriate. A lot of them I think need to be set to be on rather than off, and you can vary that to get the results that you want, and you can edit that at a later stage. But I would suggest having a good look at that, and generally most of these options you probably want to be set on here. Down the bottom we've got a test mode and a number of different emailing options for notifications and so on. And the final option here is we have the ability now to apply this to a condition. So we can apply this to users, we can apply this to domains. In this case, I've applied it to my total domain. So what it means here is you can have multiple policies and apply them to maybe a different domain, different set of users. So this is the reason that we have multiple policies available to us. Now, when you've set all those options, you basically go in down the bottom here and save the option, and you should see the policy to be updated. Now, remember that you can have as many policies as you want. They may apply to different users, different domains, but as a best practice, always have your custom one and the default one, and you can obviously go in there and add additional ones as required there. Now, if we go to outbound spam here, you'll see that the outbound spam configuration has now moved into the Security and Compliance Center. So it used to be in the Exchange Admin Console, but has now moved into a new location. So let's open that up so we can have a look at that before we go over a bit of a layout of our outbound spam. So the anti-spam settings here, you'll see that, again, what we've got is we have our inbound policy. So here's our custom policy, here's our default inbound policy, and now down the bottom we have our outbound spam policy that we can configure. So you can see that what's going to happen is probably over time is all the anti-spam malware policy is going to move into the Security and Compliance Center. So for the time being, if you do want to configure your inbound spam filter, you can still do it in the Exchange Admin Center, but going forward it's probably going to be in the Security and Compliance Center. Now, how can we get to this? Well, basically if you go to your Security and Compliance Center via your admin console, we scroll down to Threat Management, and if we go to Policy, you'll see now there's an option here for our anti-spam. So that's where that will appear, and that will take us to the same screen. Now, if we want to have a look at the options for our outbound spam filtering policy, we can do that here. But before we go in and have a look at the specifics, let's just pop out and have a quick discussion of the overview for outbound spam. So you'll see our outbound spam filtering arrangement here is very similar to what we saw with inbound. So again, it goes through a number of AV engines on the way out, and it's again thrown away if it is determined to be bad. We've also got our transport rules once again that we can throw in against this. And then after that, it goes through this spam protection. So remember, this is outbound spam sent by a user. Now, why do we want to have an outbound filtering option? Well, let's say a mailbox gets compromised and the attacker uses that to send lots and lots of emails out to random people, basically using that as a spam bot. We don't want that, so we want to make sure that it goes through our safe sender. It also goes through heuristics, and we have advanced spam management on there that we can again detect this and report that, and then it will flow through normally if it passes all those results. So it is a little bit simpler than inbound, but again, it's important to remember that all our outbound messages are also scanned and checked for viruses and so on, and also subject to transport rules, and then has the spam protection before they're actually sent on. Now, with that, let's pop back and look at our outbound spam policy in detail. Okay, so we're back here in our Security and Compliance Center. We're looking at our the mail policies here. Remember that we found that by going into Threat Management and then going into Policy and then selecting the option here for anti-spam. So if we go in and edit the policy here, this is the default policy. My suggestion to you is that you probably want to put in some people here that will be notified when a suspicious outbound email message is sent. This may or may not be set in your environment. You also probably want to notify people, including an administrator, if a sender is blocked because of outbound spam. So generally the outbound spam filter doesn't have these notifications in place. You probably want to go in and add that. The other option we've got down here is our recipient limits. Now, what this means is we can limit the amount of emails that are sent out on an hourly and also a daily basis. So my best practice would be generally 90 emails per hour is a good limit, and again a daily limit of about 750, but you can vary that if you do need to do that. But that's just my best practice, and the idea with that is to prevent, again, a mailbox being taken over and then blasting out hundreds or thousands of emails unknowns to the user. Now, when any of those limits are exceeded, we have the option down here to restrict the user from sending email. You'll see that we can also block them or restrict them until the following day, or we can take no action and just send an alert. So my best practice again will be to restrict the user from sending email. So that is our outbound spam filtering. So remember, we have an inbound custom policy, which here we can turn off and on. We've also got a default spam filtering policy, which I don't recommend you generally change. You use your custom one to do what you need. We also have an outbound spam filtering policy, which I recommend you go in and at least put the notifications for emails when spam is detected outbound, as well as probably putting limits on the emails being sent out per hour. The last option that I would suggest that you need to consider when we're talking about anti-spam here in Microsoft 365 is under the connection filter policy, which is also listed here. Now, if we go in here and expand that and edit that, you'll see that the connection policy filter, and again, we can have as many of these as we want, is designed to, again, set up a policy to allow from a certain email address, but also block from certain email addresses. So if you do want to block spam based on IP addresses, you can certainly do that. And that's the concept largely behind a connection filter. But for anti-spam, I would suggest that this little option down here is one that you also want to go and turn on. So if we mouse over this, you'll see that Microsoft is using a third-party list of trusted senders, and the idea here is this is a bit of a white list. So again, there's no real details on what these actually are. Microsoft maintains that, works with third-party vendors to do that. So my advice to you would be certainly turn this on, because this is going to be trusted, a reputation from a large group of users, and that's going to prevent, some of these more common email services potentially being seen as spam. So remember that what you need to do is go into the default connection policy that you have, filter policy, and select the option here to turn on the safe list. Generally, that is not turned on by default. All right, so in summary, what we've done is we've gone into the admin center. We've gone firstly into the Exchange console and had a look at the traditional filtering options. These are beginning to move into the security and compliance area. These are found under the policy option here under threat management. You'll see that we see all our policies together, our inbound, our outbound, and also our connection filtering. Best practice is to set up a custom inbound filter with the settings that you want. Make sure you lock it down to the settings that make sense. I've given you some best practices recommendations there. Then go and modify the outbound spam filtering, especially for the notification emails to let you know when outbound spam is happening in your organization, and also to limit sending. And finally, go into the connection filter policy option here, and again make sure that you have that safe list item checked at the bottom. All of those together, configured correctly, I think will give you a really good anti-spam protection for your organization. Remember, it may take a little bit of time to work out exactly what works for your organization, but the great thing about policy is we can adjust them, we can set them up as required, and we can, again, apply different people inside those policies. So we've got that flexibility here. Now, most importantly of all, I've showed you how to do this in the web interface. You can obviously do all of this with PowerShell. Once you get the configuration that works for you, then I would create a script and I would apply those using PowerShell so you get that consistent application across multiple tenants if you are managing that. So hopefully that's given you a better overview of what you can do with the anti-spam settings in Exchange Online for Office 365 and for Microsoft 365. Also giving you a couple of best practices there that I would recommend that I find that work really well. So hopefully that's been of benefit to you. And again, thanks for watching this video.